one of the greatest musical thinkers of our time, says, "I am standing alone on a beach, listening to the Pacific. As each wave rolls in, booming, roaring, growling, hissing, I listen to its voice, the unique contours of its rising and falling, its singular crescendo and diminuendo. I listen for the interval between this wave and the wave before it, and the one that comes after that. I listen as the waves advance and retreat, melding and passing through one another, crashing like cymbals on the shore. I listen to the small stones clattering over one another, pulled inexorably back into the unimaginable vastness of water that stretches its way towards Asia. I do my best to listen as intently, as deeply as I can. Even so, my mind wanders. A plastic bottle among the rocks reminds me that there are vast islands of garbage drifting far out at sea. A strong gust of wind reminds me of the increasingly capricious weather and of the storms that lash this and other shores with a growing ferocity. The burning sunlight reminds me of melting tundra and expanding deserts, of diminishing polar ice and rising seas all over the earth. I do my best to refocus my attention, to return only to listening. Yet, how can I stand here today and not think of these things? How indeed. The very life that sustains the sounds around us is changing. Many geologists, climatologists, philosophers, historians, sociologists, and activists believe that we've now entered the Anthropocene era, one in which human beings have greatly impacted the planet's ecological systems to a negative degree. We hear of land, air, and water pollution, resulting in profound changes to land and ocean ecosystems. For action against climate change, we need to communicate its urgency to the general public by making real the interdependency of all inhabitants between Earth and ocean. Perhaps no one has articulated this web of life better than the notable marine biologist, activist, and ecologist Rachel Carson. She writes, "To stand at the edge of the sea, to sense the ebb and flow of the tides, to feel the breath of a mist moving over a great salt marsh, to watch the flight of shorebirds that have swept up and down the surf lines of the continents for untold thousands of years, to see the running of old eels and young shad to the sea is to have knowledge of things that are nearly as eternal as any earthly life can be." A growing number of musicians and artists are concerned with the intersection of music, human culture, and the environment, considering them an inseparable trio. We come from the viewpoint that music and art matter just as much as politics, activism, and science. Art has the power to renew and redefine human consciousness, human culture, and politics. Listening to music can simultaneously allow us to leave the world behind while re-engaging with the world around us in new ways. Scientists, too, are recognising the power of music to communicate a scientific message, often in a language far stronger than data presentation alone. So what are the ways by which composers have been considering the world around them? Some, like John Luther Adams, take inspiration from the world around them as the beginning of a work. As the music emerges, it becomes art in its own right, independent of extra musical associations. The listener is invited to take their own journey, finding personal meaning through the sounds. Others may paint a musical landscape, the composer imagining the world around them, perhaps the sounds that a changing world might make. And still others yet make sonifications of scientific data, manipulating musical pulse, tone, frequency, or texture to communicate the subtle specifics of a changing data set. Any of these approaches may be considered a form of activism and inspire a new mode of understanding for audience or participants. Leonardo da Vinci said, "Art is the queen of all sciences, communicating knowledge to the whole world." Perhaps by considering artistic and scientific collaborations, we can offer a deeper understanding of the Earth and its oceans. Artists and scientists are storytellers in their own rights. How have they created a new space for understanding and dialogue?
In this presentation, we focus on one particular arts-science collaboration and one that began in this very city, Hobart. Oceano is a symphony written in response to the science of the changing ocean. The name means from the ocean, and the symphony was written by Australian composer Matthew Dewey. It's his second symphony, but it's actually the product of a collaborative project that drew together different disciplines in support of the peer-reviewed science of climate change as it applies to the ocean. It is an example of the arts and sciences working together to present a story of significance for us all in a very unique and highly innovative way. The project originated due to the generosity and vision of Sue Anderson, who I'm delighted to say is here with us today. After completing a Bachelor of Fine Arts unit titled Art, Science and Marine Biology at UTAS about a decade ago, Sue saw a need to encourage and facilitate conversations and collaborations between artists and ocean scientists to bring vital ocean stories to the wider community in new ways. To achieve this, she established Linchpin, the Ocean Project. Sue describes Linchpin as an invitation to dialogue, a space where scientists articulate their science to communicators working in a different genre, an experiment of a different kind. And I encourage you to explore this website because it has lots of information about the science behind the work as well as the work itself and Linchpin's program more broadly. It is fitting that Sue has established this program in Hobart, given the concentration of marine and Antarctic scientists based here at IMAS, the CSIRO and the Australian Antarctic Division, as well as the city's status as a gateway to the far south. Through Linchpin, she has provided scholarship support to PhD candidates at IMAS, with the expectation that they will share their science with arts practitioners who are interested in expressing new findings about climate change. In turn, these collaborations have helped to raise awareness of the importance of the ocean, especially the Southern Ocean, and issues affecting it among the public. In Sue's words, the role of the ocean in supporting all life is little understood in the community as a whole. The important symptoms and signs of change are not universally received, and science holds stories of great significance for us all, but they can be locked in the world of science with its own particular science language. She asked, can we find ways of supporting the reputable science, of unpacking it and helping to tell important science stories in new ways to help to make them accessible? For the Oceano project, which ran from 2011 to 2014, she supported two PhD candidates at IMAS, Nicholas Roden and Robert Johnson, and Robert is here today as well. Nicholas's research explored the chemical changes or acidification in seawater around the coast of the Australian Antarctic Territory, while Robert's research focused on the microscopic life that lives in the sea, the phytoplankton, which are, in his words, invisible to the naked eye, yet visible in vast blooms from space, and are responsible for producing more than half the world's oxygen. In fact, every second breath we take, and much more besides. Sue's primary aim for the Oceano project was, in her words, to raise awareness that ocean chemistry is balanced for all life to flourish, yet is changing in ways that are a consequence of anthropogenic change and will affect us all, and to consider the arts as a form of communication. She writes, at a time when science was having difficulty expressing the climate change message, the project aim was to experiment by using the senses to help promote cognitive change. In particular, she recognised the capacity of music to create a hinge or a pivot between the intellect and the world of the senses, as researchers working in a range of disciplines have identified. She knew about the work of composer Matthew Dewey before starting the project and was keen to engage him to write a musical work in response to the science. Matthew had previously completed his music studies at the UTAS Conservatorium And he's now not only a well-established and respected composer, but he's also the music director of Australia's national classical music radio network, ABC Classic FM. She invited him to join the project and then brought the scientist and composer into dialogue. After a few initial meetings, Matthew admitted that he'd actually started to hear how the science might sound, and then he agreed to write the symphony. Of the collaborative process, Sue writes, "The first part of this project involved Rob and Nick describing their science to Matthew. This began with a series of meetings and conversations and moved on to generate an overview of what the team felt were the highlights in the grand narrative, which is the ocean story. Gradually, Rob undertook the major role in writing the science narrative, or science score as it became known. This was then recorded by Rob and became the basis for Matthew's composition, Ex Oceano. There were further discussions held as the score was being written. For example, Matthew had further questions for Rob when writing the second movement, which is dedicated to phytoplankton. Matthew was trying to hear the life of phytoplankton and understand why they are so important, and you can read more about that on the Linchpin website. While completing the 4-movement, 46-minute musical score, Matthew and Sue began to search for an appropriate orchestra to record the work. Recording costs in Australia drive many composers overseas, and Matthew had already recorded other music in Russia. And this time they settled on the Czech National Symphony Orchestra based in Prague, which agreed to record it in the Dvořák Hall, where this photo was taken. This concert hall is one of the oldest in Europe, noted for its fine acoustics. In fact, Dvořák himself conducted in it for its first ever event. Matthew and scientist Nick Roden travelled to Prague in September 2013 for the recording sessions, with Nick filming footage of the process. And then after the recording had been completed and edited, the final version was made available on iTunes and released on a limited edition CD. And it was released and is still available through Music Without Frontiers in Liverpool Street in Hobart. And the artwork that's included in the booklet is also very beautiful. It blends work by Sue and also by Michel Bolter, a local artist. So we'll now show a short video that showcases the project, and this is also available on the Linchpin website. Only goes for a couple of minutes.
That music was from the second movement of the symphony. We're going to take the time, in the short time we've got left, to run you through just a brief explanation of each symphony, usually each movement, from the symphony. The first movement is a lonely bass pedal point starts, followed by the entry of a single oboe. And then from that it grows, doubled with the flutes, and then the brass, and then it's finally taken on by the strings with the ethereal echo of a harp. Matthew Dewey writes, "The first movement sets the scene for the entire symphony. Introducing the musical characters and central themes, we hear the voice of the ocean, its mighty currents, and sense the enormity of its scale and influence. And so we do, the audience, hear the voice of the ocean. Just as the introductory theme finally crescendos its way to the violins, it's interrupted by a form of tone painting, by which the composer uses the technique of composing music to reflect his mind's picture of the Southern Ocean, painted through dozens of conversations between other project members. I hear schools of sea creatures flitting back and forth, vast swells of the circumpolar currents powering water across the globe, light and darkness, filtering through those same waters that have catastrophically taken up their lion's share of about half of all carbon dioxide released by human activities." And then, around 3.5 minutes into the movement, the violins come in with the primary theme, a dotted, scudding motif, as if it were thudding waves on the side of a ship, repeated and sequenced until it finally reaches a climax nearly 13 minutes later, accompanied by the thunderous rat-a-tat-tat of the snare drum, representing the ceaseless circumpolar current.
Just play a brief excerpt from it. Okay, the second movement is the one that is inspired by phytoplankton, the fundamental fabric of the ocean, the linchpin on which life depends. as Matthew wrote in his program notes on this movement, the second movement is characterised by a shimmering, active surface and a slower, calmer, deeper core, expressing the movement and character of the vast biomass of phytoplankton blooms visible from space. These remarkable microscopic creatures underpin planetary metabolism. The music in the video that we just played for you a few moments ago was taken from this movement, and we'll play the full movement at the end of our presentation after questions. So if you'd like to listen, please do stay around for that. It's only about 7.5 minutes in duration. To me, the high-pitched figures that you might have heard at the very beginning when you started to see those images of the phytoplankton, to me they're very evocative of individual phytoplankton, whereas there's some quite dramatic gestures later in the movement that I think really evoke the larger blooms of phytoplankton as visible from space. The third movement.
Matthew writes, the third movement is emotionally rather complex. It's a love letter, as if written to a loved one that we know we will lose, or perhaps have already lost. It's at once sad, longing, tender, sentimental, and conflicted. It's a description of that most precious and vulnerable concept of love, the love of anything that is most important to the self, be it partner, children, family, or it could be something or someone else. It is that which you cannot abide the thought of losing, such is the intensity. And that is the most important message of the symphony. We stand to lose that which we cannot imagine being without. The horrifying destruction of animal and plant life, ocean temperature changes, and the acidification of oceans due to absorption of human-made carbon emissions. This dramatic movement is a sombre lament on the fact that the ocean has changed more rapidly in the past 30 years than during the whole of human history.
Okay, and then the final movement. The final movement is, in the composer's words, a large piece that gives voice to the passion and doubt that one might feel when thinking about the world changing in this manner. It's an attempt to pull together all of the emotion of the preceding movements into one giant and powerful expression of dismay. Just as one might scream into a storm, there is a sense of horror and hopelessness. But this story is not over. Whilst the music points to what might be, it leaves space for a conclusion not yet reached. As the horror reaches its apex, the tumult of being brought to what we might term the living edge, there emerges an unexpected and uneasy calm. This is the sound of what opportunity we have to make change. There may not be much time, but we have to hope that there is still time. And in the last part of this quotation, Matthew is referring to the final bars of the work. There is a crescendo, so a great building of sound, and after that dies down, the calm final moments encourage us to contemplate the time we have left and what action we might take to make changes. So I'll just play a brief excerpt from the ending so you can hear this crescendo and then the calm final moments of the symphony. Okay, so just to conclude, the excerpts we have been listening to are from the recording by the Czech National Symphony Orchestra, which has now been broadcast numerous times on national radio. As the symphony has yet to be performed live by an orchestra, we do not have reviews from critics at this stage. But in lieu of these, its impact is perhaps best gauged by the response of scientist Robert Johnson after he heard the full recording of the work for the first time. He wrote to the composer Matthew, "You have touched me, you have scared me, you have moved me. You have given the world a piece of your soul, and I thank you." Both scientists involved in the project have also recognised that the symphony has had an impact on their work as scientists. In an interview with Sarah Gillam broadcast on ABC statewide on the 13th of January 2014, Robert admitted, "It's opened my eyes to the broader implications of my work, and certainly it's enabled me to communicate far more clearly the importance and the direct impact that's often missed by the general public. Life evolved in the ocean. We have this direct connection to it, and yet we often neglect that. We really do forget its importance. Being able to communicate the science in this way has really opened my eyes to the power of creative media like composition. It's certainly broadened my horizons." And in the same interview, Nicholas commented, "It has really highlighted for me how important it is for our science to be communicated in as many different ways as possible. As publicly funded scientists, I think we have a moral obligation to communicate our science to the public and to inform them about what's happening to the planet and to our oceans. So this has been a fantastic way of doing that." For the composer, conveying the passion of these scientists in the work was just as important as representing the science itself. In his program notes for the symphony, published in the CD booklet, Matthew writes, "If there is one thing that I hope to have achieved with this symphony, it is to provide a conduit for the emotions, passions and concerns of those scientists to the listener. Every note comes from many hours spent in discussion with these remarkable people." And he dedicated the symphony to the marine scientists working in this area. Looking at the bigger picture and how this symphony relates to other music composed in connection with nature and the ocean in particular, it is clear that this work stands out as the product of a true collaboration between the arts and sciences. The symphony has not just been inspired by science, but the work of Robert and Nicholas completely underpins the score and its structure. In a conversation with Robert just last week, he commented to me that he could hear his science score in the structure of the music. This symphony exists as it is because of this collaboration between the scientist, composer and artist, Sue, and would not have been the same without the dialogue behind it. In this way, the work is not only significant as an evocative and accessible piece that hopefully educates and provokes its listeners, calling them to action, but it could also potentially serve as a model for future collaborations between scientists, artists and composers. We hope to see it reach broad audiences and perhaps even inspire other scientists and composers to collaborate on works that prompt emotional responses in relation to significant issues affecting our world today. Thank you. And are there any questions or comments? Thank you. Thank you.